In 1965, Specialist Ron Dolecki was deployed to Ethiopia in support of a U.S. Army mapping mission as part of the 64th Engineer Battalion. His unit was called simply Ethiopia-US Mapping Mission and was headquartered in Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia. Specialist Dolecki and his unit were tasked with mapping the 470,000 square miles of land that made up the country. The majority of it was traversed using supply trucks, but the more remote and inaccessible locations had to be reached by helicopter. The unit's UH-1B Hueys were the vehicle of choice. On July 12, 1965, Specialist Ron Dolecki was part of a 3-man helicopter crew that was sent on a routine mapping mission in northern Ethiopia. The pilot was Chief Warrant Officer Jack Kalmbah, and the third man was Sam, an Ethiopian hired as an interpreter. Everything went according to plan until their helicopter landed to collect mapping data somewhere north of the town of Karen. As the engine was shut off and Dolecki started to unpack his gear, a hail of bullets rained down on the helicopter. The group had been ambushed by guerrillas. Dolecki recalled, "Terror struck as I saw machine gun bullets churning the ground progressively closer to me. Before I could take cover, I spotted a rifleman near the tail boom of the helicopter, carefully aiming his weapon at me. My entire body stiffened in anticipation of the bullet that was sure to come." But the guerrilla never fired that fateful shot at Dolecki. Instead, more armed men emerged from the bush. They knocked Sam, the group's interpreter, to the ground. A man raised his rifle to bash in the interpreter's head, but he was stopped by another guerrilla, who must have realized that they could not communicate with the Americans without him. Specialist Dolecki, Chief Warrant Officer Kalmbah, and the interpreter were each searched for weapons, all while bayonets were being held to their throats. By now, all the guerrillas were out in the open, numbering to 30 in total. They began to loot the American helicopter, bashing in windows with rifle butts and cutting up the cloth interior with bayonets. They then set the helicopter on fire, which went up in flames and exploded shortly after. Specialist Dolecki and his crew were told that the guerrillas were members of the Eritrean Liberation Front, or E.L.F, a secessionist movement fighting for independence from the Ethiopian government. Dolecki was told that him and his crew were being held as spies, and that they would be shot if they did not comply with orders. The spy charges seemed absurd, but the Americans had in their possession a stack of aerial photographs of the territory, which had further convinced the guerrillas. Specialist Dolecki and his crew were forced at gunpoint to trek towards the neighboring country of Sudan, over 150 miles away. The men mostly traveled at night to avoid the scorching heat of the desert. During their first 10 days of captivity, as they traveled along the northern tip of Ethiopia, the group often heard and saw search planes flying overhead. Every time, though, they were forced to take cover and never ended up being spotted. Eventually, the search planes stopped coming. The Americans had assumed that Dolecki and his crew were most likely dead. Eventually, after a long, nearly 200-mile trek, the group crossed the border into Sudan, where the Eritrean guerrillas enjoyed sanctuary. The guerrillas started to become visibly relaxed, as they were now traveling through friendly territory, and their numbers decreased to about 6 men. The men knew that they couldn't all escape at once. That would be too obvious. They decided that the best plan would be for one of them to escape on their own. Dolecki was the youngest and the strongest out of the group, so it was decided that he would be the one to attempt escape. The next day, while his captors were distracted, Dolecki snuck off into the desert. He managed to get away unnoticed and started to head east towards Ethiopia, traveling on rocky ground when possible so as to avoid leaving a trail. In a short time, he stumbled upon an E.L.F guerrilla camp and hid behind some bushes to observe. The guerrillas looked relaxed, suggesting that Dolecki was still in Sudan. Seeing that they didn't notice him, Dolecki made a wide loop around the camp and continued east towards Ethiopia. In several hours, the sun set, and with no light from the overcast sky, Dolecki was plunged into a disorienting darkness. The only thing he could see were the reflections of the eyes of a pack of hyenas stalking him in the darkness. He heard the wild yelps of the animals and knew that he was in grave danger. Dolecki knew that if he stopped, the hyenas would surely attack him, so he kept on walking into the darkness. Eventually, he bumped into a wall of thorns, and a man appeared and pulled him behind the wall into a hut. The man lit a fire for the two of them. He did let Dolecki sleep in his hut for the night, but in the morning, he forced him to leave, probably in fear of retribution from the guerrillas. As Dolecki walked outside, he noticed that this hut was the only sign of human life for miles around. He could have very easily missed it and fallen prey to the hyenas. Dolecki thanked his lucky stars and continued on towards Ethiopia. The sun had risen behind a mountain in the distance, giving Dolecki a landmark to orient himself to. What he didn't realize was that the true distance between him and the mountain was much farther than he could manage in a day, much less in his current condition. Dolecki said, "My clothes became drenched with sweat, clinging to my body like a second skin. My saliva dried to the consistency of paste, which I had to skim off the roof of my mouth periodically to make breathing easier. I cursed the sun and the hellish condition it created in that torrid land. I began to stagger when I realized I would not reach my mountain goal that day." He eventually came across a well in the middle of the desert, with water at ground level. Dolecki drank as much as he could manage, and then splashed himself with the remaining water. He knew that he couldn't stay at the well for much longer, because it had to be of importance to the guerrillas, so he continued walking. Eventually, though, he fell to the ground, unconscious from exhaustion and the heat of the sun. After some time, Dolecki regained consciousness and somehow managed to continue walking. By nightfall, he had reached a small village, where the villagers gave him water and shelter for the night. After he had explained his situation to them, they talked it over amongst themselves, and in the morning, a villager led Dolecki to a nearby border post, where Sudanese police seemed to recognize him. They drove him to a walled compound nearby, where he was questioned and given fresh water. Eventually, Dolecki was flown out to a hospital at the US-controlled Kagnew Station back in Ethiopia, where he was given medical care and a chance to rest. He had lost 15 pounds and was extremely dehydrated, but surprisingly, he had not caught any diseases from the ordeal. The next day, it was discovered that the two other helicopter crew members had been released by the E.L.F. somewhere in Sudan. All three crew members had made it through safely. Dolecki was grateful to have survived. Back in the States, he applied for a job at the CIA and worked there for many years, interpreting satellite photos. In 2004, he decided to apply for the Prisoner of War Medal. The Army turned him down though, claiming that since the E.L.F. was not directly at war with the United States, his captors were not legitimate enough to warrant the medal. Backed by several U.S. senators, battalion commanders, and friends, Dolecki has since applied 4 times for the award. He's been turned down time and time again until now. His application has been forwarded to the Secretary of the Army for consideration, a significant step forward for Dolecki. In an email, Lieutenant Colonel Gabriel Ramirez said, "The Secretary of the Army is reviewing archival document and eyewitness accounts from others present throughout Mr. Dolecki's experience to make a decision on Mr. Dolecki's eligibility for the Prisoner of War Medal as an authorized exception to policy."